I have two computers open on my dining room table here. I feel like I'm at work. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Good night. Welcome back. Welcome to week 5. Sorry, it's stormy here in Hartford, so I hope I don't have bad internet. It's been weird. So guess we'll find out. I wanted Krista to talk a little bit about some final housekeeping things before we get started.
Okay, so on your screen is the mindfulness certificate that will be distributed through the Cricket Hall of Fame. So if you are interested in a certification, can you just include your full name, the way how you want it written on the certificate, and then your email address so that we can send it to you.
So a certificate of completion to validate you have completed the course. Excellent. Love to see it. I see some stuff in the chat. All righty.
All right, so
we're going to transition over to some slides, and I just wanted to say welcome back, everyone. We're in week 5. Next week is our final week. I just got a pop up. Your internet is unstable. Can you guys hear me okay?
yes.
Okay, great. Next week will be our final week. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end of today. But again, thank you for coming back. Thank you for showing up. And tonight we're going to be touching on the stress response and trauma, why it's parallel, why do we talk about it, and why it's important to understand trauma in regard to mindfulness. And it really dovetails nicely into what we talked about last week, which is coping skills. So we had some really great discussion last week about different coping skills and techniques people utilize. Some great sharing took place. So I was very grateful for that. Got to hear some great ideas or read some great ideas in the chat. So utilizing those different coping mechanisms and looking at trauma will be important as we kind of move through the content tonight. So the content tonight is very, I would say, primary in regard to trauma and why it's infused in mindfulness work. And the reason why it's infused in mindfulness work, because of two things. One, we come to a road, right, with two things when we have obstacles in our life. And it's our past experiences that shape our coping skills and our resilience, which we've talked about in the last few weeks, what resilience means to us and our own journey to kind of manage stressors, adversity in our lives. And the second thing is understanding your past experience and how it affects you moving forward to adapt your own mindfulness plan. So it's really interesting. We're going to share some real great definitions and talk about adverse childhood experiences in relation to trauma. We have an exceptional video to show this evening. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who is a neuroscience, neurological surgeon. Sorry, I'm getting my words all fumbled today. She's excellent, and her expertise is in the area of trauma. So we're going to watch that video and see how it affects public health. But I also want to pay special attention and just recognize again, hold space for the current climate in our country. I mentioned this last week. We're at kind of a pivotal crossroads in regard to racial discord in our country, in particular trauma, generational trauma, racial trauma, and how police violence is affecting BIPOC individuals on a daily basis. So I think we're kind of at a critical turning point here of accountability, and it could be really triggering, right? So when we talk about trauma, it's really important for you as the attendee to understand things that trigger you. Now, Krista and I always say, we're not licensed counselors. We're not, that's not our area of expertise. We're educators. So it's really important that you recognize what your triggers are, that you understand if, you need to step away from the content. Again, tonight's real basic definitions. We're not getting into deep DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for trauma. That's a whole other workshop. So, but I just want to pay special attention and be intentional about the topic. Take the time. If you have to step away, that's totally fine. And I really would like to encourage utilizing the chat function for some great dialogue. I know, Krista, we're going to be monitoring the best that we can as we kind of move forward. Okay. So that's what we're going to talk about this evening. All right, so when we consider the definition of trauma, and again, this is real primary definition. So this is from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The definition of trauma is a result of an event, series of event, or set of circumstances. The key takeaway here that I want you to see is it's individual. So why that's important? It's important because how events affect me are going to be different than how they affect you. So understanding what that means is your own trauma personality, I guess you would say, and how you move through life circumstances in depending on what happens to you. So it's very individual. What you experience physically, emotionally, could be all of these different things that can have lifelong lasting effects, particularly as you move through adulthood, right? So both Krista works with young children, and I work with young adults. So we see the adverse effects of trauma in our daily work that we do all the time, because it does can create cognitive imbalances and barriers and obstacles for people to function. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in regard to a public health issue and kind of moving through to achieve balance. All right, nothing in the chat, just names. Okay. All right, sorry, my screen is acting up. So what is trauma and why is it important to the stress response? Krista and I are going to talk to you about what's called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs for short. And ACEs are significant instances or experiences that you've had as a child that impact you into your adult life, exposure to different traumas. So they can be different criteria. For example, experiencing violence in the home, domestic violence, drugs, incarceration. What else am I missing, Krista, on that list? Complex,
violence, right?
Yep, any type of violence, neglect, emotional abuse, which can be extremely traumatic for a young child, not having an emotional bond, parental substance abuse, and any type of parental or familial mental health issues in the home. So you're a child and you grew up in the house with someone that has significant mental health issues diagnosed or on, that can affect you in terms of an adverse childhood experience. What's interesting here with the data, and I love numbers, Krista and I are big data people, about 80% of the people who are responsible for child maltreatment were abused themselves or have some sort of significant childhood experiences, or one or more. So it's interesting when you think about that statistically. It's about 1 in 6 adults have at least one adverse childhood experience. So that's two thirds of adults. So if you have one adverse childhood experience, so take, for example, you grew up in a home with someone with a mental health issue, chances are that you have other adverse childhood experiences as well. And it could be violence, it could be emotional abuse, manipulation, other things like that, neglect. So when you think about it, people in your life that you know, 1 in 6, that's a pretty high number. Would you say, Krista? Like that's a correlation that we can all kind of relate to in one way or another. And why it's important, because a lot of times I saw this I don't know, it's on Instagram, and you see pictures and, you know, memes and things like that. And I think I shared this with you, Krista, and it said, if adults, you know, if childhood stressors didn't exist, why are there so many dysfunctional adults? You know, to that effect. So really, it's interesting. Oh, no, this is what it was. I'm sorry. If children are so resilient, why do adults have so much trauma from childhood? It's just interesting, because we're talking about resiliency during the pandemic, right? Like children, oh, kids are resilient, they'll bounce back. You know, we're hearing a lot about that, especially now with COVID, and our kids have been out of school, right? But it's interesting when you look at the data and you look at what's in front of you here, particularly on this slide, a lot of the experiences that they carry with you through adulthood. And it's called like adaptation, how you adapt in social situations, relationships that you have, whether it's your family or your partners, etc., jobs that you choose. It's all significant in terms of the stress response and coping skills. What's next? All right, Krista talked about some of these, but this is just a, you know, kind of like a cumulative list in regard to events that could cause trauma. So when you're thinking about your own experiences and you look at this list, you can go back to that statistic of 1 in 6 and say, I know people who have experienced this, or I've experienced these things myself. So some of these, I don't know if any of these surprise anybody. Some of them are the more, I would say, overt or obvious causes of trauma, but others may not be so much, right? Immigration violence is on there. That's a new criterion. Motor vehicle accident or sudden disaster. That one always gets some, that's interesting. I know a few people who have been in significant car accidents who have purchased a larger vehicle because it makes them feel safer, right? Being a victim of or witnessing violent crime, bullying, huge, right? We try to teach kids to be resilient and, you know, sticks and stones type of thing, but bullying can cause significant damage to children and adults too. There's bullying that goes on for grown folks as well, particularly on social media. And then some of these other things, you know, we talked about in the previous slide. Sexual abuse, assault, victimization, harassment, experiencing chronic racism, homophobia, or bias, experiencing a natural or man-made disaster. So think about COVID, right? Some people have trauma response from COVID. Lost your job, you got COVID, was sick, you lost someone, you know, goes on and on and on. Is death of a parent at an early age considered a trauma? Miss Ivy, I would put that on there in regard to, I would categorize that in with the parent, separation from a parent, incarceration or divorce. And I think just death in general, grief and loss can cause trauma, particularly at a young age. And there's no familiar replacement, if you will, for that parent. Sure, that could be a game changer. Yep. So I would categorize significant loss that has, developmental consequences. Anything else in the chat here? No. We pulled this information from the American Psychological Association. So it's relatively new data. So we'll add the loss of a parent on there. Did I miss it? No. Okay. There's so many bullets, they run together. What else? Substances, living with a parent who, go back one, Krista. Sorry. Living with a parent who abuses, if you can't go back, it's okay.
Yeah.
Abuses substances or mental health issues. Let's talk about that for a second. So I think sometimes these issues, and when you look at this list, some people think these are really personal issues, right? Like a lot of times, some families would equate these as like their dirty secrets. And I put that in air quotes because I think every family experiences any one of these things, right? To a varying degree. I don't know any families that have escaped any of these things, at least one, right? So I think it's important to understand that too. The substance abuse and the mental illness is a big thing that I want to touch on because I think it's one of those things that people don't like to talk about, right? It has a lot of shame. So when you equate shame into some of these categories, what happens is it creates stigma. And when you have stigma, things don't get addressed and don't get talked about and don't get discussed. And it's very isolating. So then it could be years later when you're having a conversation with someone and something triggers you and you're not quite sure what it is. And it could just be, the way someone's responding to you or acting, or you talk to someone and you're realizing, wow, that happened to me too. And you don't feel as isolated because people have commonalities. Remember the stat, 1 in 6 adults have experienced some sort of trauma as a child, as an adult, but as a child. Polyvictimization is a whole other thing. And what that means is multiple traumas as an adult. So you can experience multiple traumas in your adulthood that could categorize the same thing and have equal or compounding health issues for you. The other thing to think about, and we're going to talk about this a little later, all of these things carry, in my professional opinion, they're public health crisis. And sometimes, years ago, when we looked at this list, oh, it's a social service issue. This is for the social workers, right? No, these issues, by and large, probably 100% of the time, people who experience these things have some sort of significant health issue attached to it, right? Okay, what's next?
So according to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, close to 40% of students in the United States have been exposed to some form of traumatic stressor in their lives, with sexual assault, physical assault, and the witnessing of domestic violence being the 3 most prevalent. In Hartford, I remember hearing the statistic a few years ago that it's 8 out of 10 students in the classroom have experienced some sort of trauma. That's 80%. You may as well, that's almost 100% of your, there's 80% of your classroom that has documented some sort of trauma. So you can only imagine what the classroom, what the atmosphere is within the classroom just entering.
Sure. And the barriers to learning. So that's a whole other thing. So not addressing the trauma, you can't even scratch the surface on developmental learning competencies.
Right. So then the next is children who are exposed to traumatic experiences, they display various reactions such as grief, difficulties with attention and focus, academic problems, difficulties regulating their emotions, physical aggression, or non-compliance. So in my capacity, I'm a special education teacher, and I work with kids from birth to 12th grade. It's not necessarily, you know, when you hear special education, a lot of people think that it is intellectual disability. Something's wrong with the child. They can't learn. A lot of it, the majority, is that those behavioral issues, and really working. And if you're seeing that, you know, 8 out of 10 kids have traumatic experiences, and this is what they can present as, is it really special education, or is it lack of relationships, or they had some sort of experience, you know, traumatic experience? So just, you know, something to think about, because, you know, childhood trauma, you know, as we said before, it persists into adulthood. You know, if it's unresolved, it turns into, you know, mental illness. It can lead to addiction. There's also a very high correlation between trauma and high-risk behaviors such as smoking, risky sexual activity. And then when we look at these systems, you know, that we have in place, our African-American students are 4 times more likely than their Caucasian counterparts to be suspended from school, and that begins at pre-K. And these are the underlying issues that really need to be addressed, those coping skills. We have to figure out, you know, how, what we need to do to put in place for our students, our children, to be able to cope, to become functional adults.
I think de-escalation training is significant. So not only like thinking about police, right, law enforcement, but just in general, like think about the schools. So when you're talking about outbursts, physical aggression, or non-compliance, you know, what is the cause there? So understanding how to de-escalate these situations so they don't turn on a dime so quickly. And the end result shouldn't be violence begets violence, right? So if somebody is exerting, you know, behavior that's off-putting and upsetting to someone, you got to get people in there who can be okay managing that type of physicality until it gets to a certain point, and then how to de-escalate in that situation.
Right, but I think also realizing that our children are coming into the school with these experiences, and so really focusing on that social, emotional piece, really building those relationships. A lot of, you know, people really focus on the academic piece of it, and you know, social emotional skills, self-regulation, those, once again, back to those executive function skills, those have a higher kind of correlation to success over IQ. So really realizing those are the skills that our children need, you know, adults need to be successful. That if they have those, the academics will come, you know. So really focusing on that piece.
The connectedness. So, you know, you think about the time children spend in school, what is it, like 88 or 80% of their time spent in school? So I think that it's such a critical issue, you know, for educators to understand and to wrap their, you know, pedagogy around to deal with these issues. When you consider your 88% of the classroom, that's what, maybe like 1 or 2, 1.5 students, 1, 2,
right,
that don't have anything. It is maybe including the teacher, but probably not, right? Because we just looked at 1 in 6 adults. So the other thing that's interesting is the high risk behavior. So this is, I see this a lot on college campuses, and I think that this is something that needs to be considered, because part of a trauma diagnosis, like a clinical diagnosis, is looking at and considering the arousal response. So Krista talked about it here, like high risk behaviors, substance use, smoking, high risk sexual activity, impulsivity, stealing, other things of that nature is equated to your arousal response. And I think that has a lot to do with how impacted you are with trauma and understanding that. So there's also a lot of shame in this area too, particularly if someone is, say, very sexually active. This is an interesting criteria for someone who's experienced child sexual abuse. They may be highly promiscuous. Why? Because it's comfortable. And that sounds like a very parallel, outrageous thing to say, but it's the comfort and the trauma. So it's very strange how your brain adapts. It's trying to protect you.
Right.
But not managed properly can be very, very damaging and could end in death, right? Which we see time and time again in the news. And then the last bullet, Krista, you talk about is huge. There's so much there. There's so many great books on like the school to prison pipeline.
Right.
Oh my gosh. We have to put that in the resource link if people are interested in that, because there is a high correlation between that. Okay. So trauma can be complex. And Krista talked about this a few slides back, but it can be any one single event or it can be a reoccurring event. So for example, violence in the home that's happening constantly. So you get the kid in school, they love the teachers, they're happy to be in school. And then when it starts to get time to leave, you notice a spike in behavior because they got to go home to the environment that's abusive or violent, right? That's very patterned. So trauma is complex, it's very layered, and it's very personal. And it's largely developmental, meaning when it happens, it has long-term effects. And the other part that I want people to take away is historical or intergenerational trauma. What does that mean? What does that mean? That means families can pass down their trauma. When you think about, this gets correlated in terms of also gender and race as well, is trauma. It's historical related, but intergenerational trauma. So that means that the cycle keeps going. So until people can interrupt the trauma cycle and create boundaries and address the trauma, whether it's familiar or whatever, then it will continue. So then say it's like in a family. So and it just gets passed down based on learned behavior. So if you learn that when you're upset, you don't talk to someone and are unable to communicate your feelings, and you're a child and you see an adult behave that way, when you grow, you're going to start behaving that way because that's all you know. That's a very basic example. Do people understand what I'm saying when I talk about intergenerational trauma? And it also can be linked to other things like substance use. So it's something to consider. It exists and it can be broken. All right. We are moving along. What's next? All right. A public health issue. So trauma is a public health crisis. Why? Because consider what Krista was talking about before with children. When children experience trauma and it's unresolved and they don't have adults in their lives to connect with, to address it, it carries over into the adult developmental span, and therefore can cause serious effects across the lifespan that affect health. Not just your physical health, but your mental health and your environmental health. And it's really considered a public health issue by the CDC recently, as of 2016, because it's so widespread. And when you consider the issue. So for example, I used to work with patterned abusers for the state of Connecticut. I worked as a domestic violence counselor in the hospitals a few years ago. And what I would do too is I would work with offenders, because you have to have the whole cycle. You have to work with both sides. So we work with both the survivors of violence and also the perpetrators of violence to stop perpetrating the violence, right? You have to address the issues. So you have to talk to the abusers about their adverse childhood experiences, what's going on in their life. 80% of it's mostly men statistically who are abusers. Now, there are women who are abusive. That happens, particularly in same-sex relationships. However, when you're talking about men who are primarily abusers, there's a significant amount of health issues. Heart disease is because of the stress. Remember in week 2, we talked about physiological effects of stress and staying in that keyed up stress response when you're waiting for a fight constantly damages your heart, because you can't level down. You can't, Krista talked about it before, you can't regulate yourself. So you're constantly up here. So one of the things like working with abusers, particularly through the court system and the prison system, was accountability. Looking at their patterns, showing them witness photos, playing the 911 calls. I mean, there's a lot of data that shows that that works for recidivism. Tough work, though, I tell you that. That's tough stuff. But I really feel it's important, like working with families, Krista. So if you have a child, Krista works with families all the time. If you have a child that's experiencing having behavioral issues, working with the family is critical for success. Because Krista can do all this work at school and then they go home and it's all undone if you don't have the family on board.
Right, but then it goes back to that kind of the generational trauma, or the family trauma. I'll give you an example. I had a student who, she was 3 years old and she was a behavioral student, so she would be running out the classroom. We found out that the father was killed when she was about 3 months, so she never knew the father. So I said to the teacher, this child has trauma. So the child doesn't have relationships. And the teacher said, oh, well, she didn't know her father, so that's not trauma. She wasn't there. And I said, well, her mother knew the father and her mother grieved and her support system was grieving as well. So when this child was being raised, she was being raised with people who probably needed some additional mental health and support, and it wasn't there. So she's had some broken relationships. You know, she needs some work. She needs some counseling. She needs some social work. She needs relationship building, you know? So that's just an example of, you know, it, that could turn, you know, with the right supports in place, you know, you can help make a situation better.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a challenge when you're working with children, right? Because you are putting a lot on the supports at home. See, with college students, it's sometimes, I don't want to say easier, but as young adults, you know, they can make a choice, right?
Right.
And decide if, you know, this family environment is toxic for me. It's making me sick. It's damaging. And then what can I do to not go home? I need to stay on campus, get a job, you know, like resilience skills to be independent. Exactly. It's tough work. I don't think we'll ever be out of jobs though, because consider again the statistics. 1 in 6. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to make light of it, friends. I'm really not. Okay, so when you think about some of the things we're talking about, and even when you kind of consider it in yourself, there's common reactions to trauma. And they sometimes may seem like, oh, you know, the first one to me is huge. And I'm going to tell you why. Avoidance is a trauma response. And sometimes people say, oh, I can't deal with it. I just have to step away. Like I can't deal with it. I don't even want to talk about it. But for somebody else close to you, it's always there, right? So avoidance is a tough one because it kind of teeters into that boundary, ground. Like I'm taking care of myself by not doing this or not talking about it. And I totally honor that. But I think that there's a difference and it's very slight. It's so slight that you might not even notice it. But it's when you avoid people, places, conversations, or anything that reminds you of that traumatic event. So when you avoid, you displace or compartmentalize, and it comes up in other places in your life. Just naturally, like it's wild how that happens. And if you've experienced this, you know what I'm talking about. Because the triggers can come at any time. The grocery store, in the car, someone could say something to you, and you're like, wow, where'd that come from? So I think the avoidance one is really huge that people don't really consider, because some people feel, oh, they don't want to talk about it, or, that not that people should be forced either. So I just want to be clear about that. But I always think the best way to tackle a situation is to work through it. When you go up or under or around, it's always going to come back. Okay. Isolation, we've been talking about that a lot over the last 5 weeks. But when it comes to trauma, this is very intentional. So pulling away on purpose from family events or social gatherings as a result of a trauma. And then some other ones, Krista talked about this with the children, intense fear and worrying, big one. Particularly if someone's experienced violence and they're afraid to go outside of their house. So if you live in a neighborhood where there's shootings that happen frequently, or lots of violence, there may be fear associated with going to school, getting groceries, going to the pharmacy, things that seem small that we may take for granted. But for someone experiencing trauma, it could be very detrimental to their life experience. Anger and intense sadness are like the toxic couple that could, because they go hand in hand. So you could be full of rage 1 second and then completely, throttled by sadness the next. Very uncontrollable. The next one is about triggers. So trigger memory presents itself in flashbacks. So flashing back on a certain event, whether you hear it in your head, replay it, smells. I also am a sexual assault advocate, so I work a lot with sexual assault survivors, and this is huge for people who've experienced sexual trauma. Flashing back to when the assault took place, particularly the smells and the sounds that can come out of nowhere.
Also with domestic violence, like loud bangs, stuff like that, like door slamming.
Startle response.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, startle response, Krista. That's huge. That's a good point. Just unnerved, like people yelling and that's a big one. Reenactment, expressing fears or elements of trauma through play. So Krista works with children a lot. And I'm sure there's play therapy that goes hand in hand with trauma.
Yeah.
To kind of, explain them. Children can express themselves through play. So you can kind of see cognitively what's going on there. And then finally, silence or loss of acquired communication skills. So there are instances trauma is so significant that people stop talking. Shock response, right? Or choose to stop talking. I'm sure, Krista, you see that a lot with children.
Yeah, we have a few kids. I've worked with a few kids that, were selective mute in certain situations. And they, you have to do significant therapy to get them
Yeah,
to talk at school. So
that's deep trauma. And think about that for a second. Your trauma is so severe that your brain is telling you not to communicate because it's too hurtful.
right.
That's intense. All right. So I think on the next slide is the video. Yes.
All right.
I hope you enjoy this as much as I do. It's very informative. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris specializes in trauma in the brain. And this is just a great TED Talk. I think it's about, is it 15 minutes? I don't know how long it is.
We'll find out.
Sorry, it's Mia. Yeah, you hear Mia? I'm going to turn my camera off to get. Krista, can you share the audio? Is it not working?
I think because I'm mute. Okay, let me start it over.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Technical difficulties.
Okay.
It's all right, Chris. Please hold while we figure it out.
Can you hear it?
Nope, not hearing anything.
It stopped, or you were able to hear it at one point?
I'm not hearing you, but I'm not hearing the thing, none of it.
Okay, hold on. Can you hear it now?
No.
Kenna, are you able to play the video on your screen?
If you let me screen share, I could try. Let me pull
All
it
right.
up. Hold on.
I don't know if I can let you screen share. Okay, hold on.
Please hold, friends. It's a digital world. What are you going to do? Can you hear? Yep.
In the mid-90s, the
Yes.
CDC and Kaiser Permanente.
Yes.
Kenna, you can't mute.
The immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart and lung cancer and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our biology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference.
Uh-oh. Buffering. I think it's my internet. Hold on, guys. Okay, so I don't want to waste more time with not working correctly. We will put the link to the video in the chat, and then I really am going to encourage folks to watch this. Dr. Burke, she's a pediatrician, and she focuses on neuroscience, as I said before, and it's just an exceptional talk on all the things that we cumulatively were discussing before about adverse childhood experiences. I am so sorry, friends. Please hold. Here's the link. All right. Okay, I'm back. I think I'm gonna, I don't know, I think I'll mute my video because maybe my internet is unstable. I keep getting a message that says it's unstable. Yikes. Okay, anybody have any questions so far or comments you want to put in the chat? Please use the chat feature. That'd be great. Okay, so segueing into interpersonal mindfulness and why it's important in regard to trauma and stress is managing stress is personal and it's really your own individual journey. So we talked a lot in the beginning of the workshop session about bioindividuality. And I can't stress that enough because what works for me may not work for you. And I think that that's really critical. It's also important to understand that when you seek out practitioners, because a one size fits all, you should run. It's not going to work, okay? So interpersonal mindfulness is conceptualized as mindfulness during your own interpersonal interactions, includes self-awareness. Having self-awareness is a critical life skill. This coincides with everything that we've talked about so far in relation to how you cope and manage your stress, AKA how resilient you are. And it also be paired with non-judgment and a non-reactive presence. So what do you think I mean by that? Oftentimes we're surrounded by people that are very critical. Why did you do that? Or you should do this, or don't do that. We've talked about this a lot. I always talk about having space that is non-judgmental and safe is so critical to being able to thrive as a human being, period. And a non-reactive presence, what does that mean? That means if I were to tell you, I wanted to, go back to school to become a dentist, people wouldn't say, what? What's wrong with you? Why are you doing that now in your life? I just picked dentist because people that know me know I hate the dentist. So, people that are supportive around you, that's reasonable. So if someone gives you, a life experience that's completely off the rails, I think you have a responsibility to say, I'm a little concerned about you. But, you want to have people who don't react in a judgmental way. So why do we talk about trauma and stress? Because it all connects back to how resilient we are and how we manage our stress. So it kind of dovetails into our coping skills and whether we reach to different substances or not, and having awareness. So Krista talked a little bit about having like trauma, being diagnosed clinically or by a medical professional with trauma. There's 8 different criteria that fall into that diagnoses. Okay, so I just want to be really clear about that. It's a very intentional diagnosis that medical providers would go over for you. And we talked a lot about exposure being the first, right? So what type of trauma have you been exposed to? And then what follows subsequently are all of the other elements that we kind of talked about. So reoccurring flashbacks, replaying, avoidance, negative changes in your thought or mood that worsen over time based on the event. Krista talked about the arousal response, right? Being easily startled. Hypervigilance actually is a trauma response, which is interesting. And then these type of characteristics have to take place for more than a month, right? So if you are someone maybe experiencing some of these things, really seek out medical advice and seek out care from a medical provider for appropriate referrals. And that's the last bullet there, which is about awareness. When we can be aware and mindful of others, the world just opens up in what we would equate to being empathetic. When we have empathy, we can understand others. And it's really, really important to also have that awareness for yourself as human beings.
Right. And I think the goal kind of all of this, of all these 5 weeks leading up to our 6th week, is really changing the way that we see stress, changing the way that we view our problems, trying to look at it from a different lens, and essentially reframing, the stress response.
Definitely. That's very huge. And it takes practice, right? It's like riding a bike, doing reframe. The more you do it, the more easily it when you need it to.
Right. Positive thinking and, creating the plans to how are we going to resolve the problem, or looking at it, as maybe not a problem, looking at it, as I said, reframing it in a different lens, and being mindful and present about what you can handle, what you can address today, and what is out of your control.
Oh, I love that, Krista. Limitations, that's huge. That's good boundary setting. Nice job.
Thank you.
Yes. What's next? Okay, so we're kind of wrapping it up. We're getting right to 8 o'clock. So I guess my technical difficulties was right on time. So again, I encourage you to please watch the TED Talk on your own. It's excellent. And then ask yourself some of these questions. You know, now this was a very brief overview of trauma, okay? Very elementary definitions, just scratching the surface of understanding what trauma is. When you think about it, how do you think trauma fits into your own stress response, if at all, when you think about adverse childhood experiences, right? And how aware are you about that? So as Krista was talking about with the reframe and having awareness, that's critically important to understanding trauma in your life. And sometimes I find with young adults, when they can talk about their experience, it's like a weight being off their shoulders, because sometimes people carry this stuff for years and years and years, right? So next week, I just want to put a little plug in for our final week, our last week. We're going to be talking about your personal mindfulness plan. And Krista and I are going to go over tools and ways in which you can derive your own mindfulness plan and thinking about the different criteria that are involved to having your own mindfulness plan. So does it have meaning? Does it have purpose? Does it have value? We're going to give you some great resources, some free guides that we have access to that we'll share with you, and some other great takeaways to kind of wrap up our time together. So I'm really looking forward to that. And what else, Krista? Anything else?
Oh, just if you haven't already, just the housekeeping, please put your name, your full name, and your email address in the chat box so that we can send you that mindfulness certificate. I think I have 3 names.
There you go. All right. Well, you don't get your name, you don't get your certificate. That's it. All right. Well, on that note, I wish everyone a wonderful evening. I hope the rest of your week is joyful and eventful, and we will see you next time.
Yes. Thank you.